I just want to thank two very special people that when I was 8 years old, I made films at home on a Super 8 camera that my mum and dad had bought for me. And they supported me all through the years, and they died in the last few years. They didn't see these films made. So for Bill and Joan, thank you.
It has grossed over $700 million to date.
The fate of the studio, to some degree, we were told, was riding on.
Do you think the second film and the third film will match
Peter
that?
Jackson.
I don't know.
13 Academy Awards are talking.
The films are what they are.
Is this the movie you set out to
I think
make?
they're 8 years incredibly well spent.
Would he like the film? It's a very difficult question.
Our first conversations were with Miramax.
I would hope he'd like the film.
So if you like the first one, you should like the
It
second.
was originally a Miramax production. Harvey Weinstein, why would you do that when it was guaranteed to disappoint? People don't realise really how close this film came to not happening. I was lying in bed on a Sunday morning, about 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, and I definitely wanted to make another film in New Zealand after The Frighteners, and I wanted to make a fantasy film. And we kept talking about how it has to be like The Lord of the Rings. And there was enough of those conversations took place that we finally decided to pick up the phone and see whether the rights to The Lord of the Rings itself was available.
Several weeks after this discussion, Peter made a call to his manager Ken Cummins and asked him if he could find out who owned the rights to The Lord of the Rings. It didn't take long for Cummins to come back to Jackson with the discovery that Lord of the Rings film rights had resided with Saul Zaentz and had been with him for nearly 30 years.
But we made the phone call and we were told that they were with a producer called Saul Zaentz,
Who'd done nothing with him for 25 years.
done nothing, didn't actually like the idea of a film being made, didn't think it was possible.
The rights to the films have been extremely protected ever since the 1978 Ralph Bakshi animated adaptation.
My name is Aragorn, son of Arathorn. If by life or death I can save you, I will.
During this time, Jackson had struck a first look deal with Miramax's Harvey Weinstein. The deal basically meant that any ideas that Jackson had for a new film, he would first have to pitch them to Harvey.
We were in a relationship with Miramax, Harvey Weinstein at Miramax, as a result of Heavenly Creatures. It was called a first look deal, which meant that anything that we wanted to do, we had to ask him first, offer it to him first. And if he said no, we were free to take it somewhere else.
Jackson's original idea was to make The Hobbit first as a standalone film, instead of the trilogy we ended up getting, and then 2 Lord of the Rings films after that.
So anyway, Fran and I called Harvey Weinstein. We were in a hotel in Sydney. I think we must have been promoting The Frighteners. We were on a press junket. I remember we called him from Sydney and asked him if he had any interest in doing The Lord of the Rings with us. Actually, the idea we originally pitched was to do The Hobbit as one movie and then to do The Lord of the Rings as 2 movies if The Hobbit was successful. That was our original phone call.
Jackson floated this idea with Weinstein but told him it may not be easy to secure the rights, which turned out to be true. 8 months of negotiations would ensue between Weinstein and Saul Zaentz. Zaentz bought the rights to The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit from United Artists back in 1976 and really wasn't looking to part with them. During the 8 months of negotiations, Jackson decided to go on holiday to the south of New Zealand, and it was there where he decided that waiting for Harvey to secure the rights to The Lord of the Rings was a risky move on his behalf, and that he was going to do the King Kong reboot that he was offered earlier that year by Universal. Harvey was furious to hear this news, and by the end of 1996, it looked like Jackson's Kong reboot may never see the screen. And then finally, in 1997, while Jackson was doing press for the international release of The Frighteners, he received a phone call. It was his manager. Universal were pulling the plug on Jackson's Kong reboot.
And I was working on a remake of King Kong for a while, and then Universal, the studio who were doing it, decided not to go ahead with it.
After The Frighteners had performed poorly, the studio no longer had faith in Jackson as a director. So after the press tour was over, he flew back to New Zealand, and it was there, in the spring of 1997, where Jackson received the news that Harvey Weinstein had managed to strike a deal with Saul Zaentz. Miramax were going to make The Lord of the Rings. The first step was to begin breaking down the book scene by scene, talking about things they'd keep, what they'd cut, or even what they'd add to the story, and pretty much how faithful they were going to be.
It was our first pass at really cracking the code of The Lord of the Rings, is the way that I sort of think of it, as basically, saying, well, the book is a great book, the story is a great story, the characters are great, but it's unfilmable, and it is unfilmable if you were to just shoot the book page by page, scene by scene.
It was at this point where Jackson really started to think that The Lord of the Rings should be 3 films, but Weinstein quickly put a stop to that, and by the end of these brainstorming sessions came a 92-page treatment for the films.
The first thing that Fran and I did was to take the 3 books of The Lord of the Rings and to break it down into what turned out to be a 90-page treatment.
The treatment took the codename Jamboree, The Life of Lord Baden-Powell. Unaware if anything they were writing was actually any good, Jackson enlisted the help of Philippa Boyens, who turned out to play a massive part in the making of this trilogy.
The collaboration between the 3 of us came down to Fran and I working incredibly closely together, locked in the hotel rooms, locked in the office at home, getting the work done. Fran then taking it to Peter and reshaping. And often we'd come to bits where we knew there was action involved. So we'd just go, they fight. And it turns into 20 minutes of the finished film.
By August 1997, storyboarding was well underway, and Tolkien artists Alan Lee and John Howe were brought on board to start creating concept art.
I remember it was incredibly difficult to find Alan Lee, who's a fairly reclusive chap, and nobody really had a phone number for him. So we eventually tracked him down to a small village near Dartmoor in England. We put together a package and we FedExed us to this address, and we were tracking the FedEx. We were literally tracking the van moment by moment. Jan, our assistant, was on the phone and she was saying, right, the van's about 50 miles from the village. And then she phoned back, yes, it's arrived in the village, it's just looking for a street. And then we got a call back from FedEx saying, yes, so it's been delivered. And we knew at that exact moment that Alan had signed for this thing at his front door and he'd got it.
He sent over a copy of Heavenly Creatures, which I'd heard of, which hadn't seen, and enjoyed very much, with a letter telling me what he was up to, and asking if I'd like to get involved. I didn't really need to think about it, actually. I just sort of said, yes, I'll come out.
And John Howe was similar. We tracked down John Howe, who lives in Switzerland.
It was really a question of waiting for them to finish so I could say yes.
Once Jackson and Co. had finished the initial treatment, they flew to New York to begin script meetings with Miramax. What would happen next was a back and forth of ideas and suggestions. Bob Weinstein was pretty big on the idea that one of the hobbits should die. They also discussed things like the budgets of the films. Harvey was insistent that the budget should not exceed $75 million.
And Harvey said, well, I only have an ability to go up to $75 million on a film. And, of course, Disney owns his company. So I understand, I'm not entirely certain, but I do understand that Harvey went to Disney and he asked permission to spend extra money to make these 2 films and was refused.
Which turned out to be a problem, because it was going to cost Miramax between $130 and $135 million to produce 2 films.
And then we ran into a real snag, because by the time we'd finished writing the screenplays and doing a lot of the development, we were able to come up with a much more definitive budget of what it was going to spend. And it was going to, at that point, these 2 movies were going to cost about $130, $140 million to make.
Harvey was not happy to hear this, as he'd already put $12 million into the project to cover development costs.
At the same time as writing the scripts, Miramax were also putting a lot of money into basically pre-production on the film. We hired a team of 30 or 40 people. We were designing the movie, we were location scouting, we had visual effects being done, we had monsters being made, computer work was happening. A lot of money was spent.
So with this news, Jackson and his partner Fran Walsh were called to attend a crisis meeting in New York. Harvey had felt that Peter had wasted $12 million in Miramax's money. That's when Harvey told Peter, you've got to do the right thing. You've got to make a single Lord of the Rings film of no longer than 2 hours in length for $75 million. And if you don't, I'll just get John Madden to direct it.
Harvey was prepared to hire other filmmakers to make his single film version, because Harvey had spent $20 million and he wasn't able just to kill it. He was now going to have to find someone else to do his movie, so he could at least get his investment back.
Jackson had held out hope for a single film with maybe a sequel to follow if the first one did well, but all hope of this was diminished when a memo arrived at Jackson's hotel marked ultra confidential with suggestions on how to cut Tolkien's books into a short 2-hour film. The suggestions included King Theoden and Denethor were combined, as were Rohan and Gondor. Éowyn would replace Faramir and become Boromir's sister. The memo also went back and forth on whether or not Saruman should be present or cut from the Battle of Pelennor Fields. The Moria sequence was also massively shortened. Jackson's thoughts on the suggestions were that they were literally guaranteeing to disappoint every single person who had read the books.
We just felt it was a recipe for disaster, but that anybody that had read the book that went along to a movie titled The Lord of the Rings was just going to be going to be disappointed, was going to be shocked at what this 2-hour version was actually going to be like. And we just said, why would you do that when it was guaranteed to disappoint?
Peter asked Weinstein if he'd be allowed to think about the situation at hand, because ultimately Jackson knew that no matter how hard he and his team worked on this compromised version of The Lord of the Rings, that he'd be met by anger and disappointment by the fans, and the blame would lie solely upon his shoulders. So with all that in mind, Jackson called up his manager Ken Cummins and said, "Just tell Harvey we can't do it. Tell Harvey to go ahead and make his movie, and good luck."
So at that point, we literally walked away from the project and we said to Harvey, we can't be involved in this anymore. So we got on the plane back to New Zealand. It's like a 20-hour flight, and we felt now that we'd come to the end of The Lord of the Rings, which was a tragedy. It's because you put so much emotional investment into these things when you work on them for so long. And
Cummins returned to Weinstein with a request. Peter and his team had put in so much work up until this point. Would Harvey give them the opportunity to go and make this film the way they envisioned it somewhere else? And surprisingly, Harvey said yes, but his terms were very strict. They had 4 weeks to find a studio, and Harvey would get all of his money back as soon as the deal was inked. He would receive 5% of the first dollar gross across the board, and if they couldn't strike a deal with these requirements met, then Weinstein would take back control, and Peter Jackson would not direct The Lord of the Rings.
And our agent, Ken Cummins, in the meantime, while we were flying that 20 hours back to New Zealand, he had called Harvey and he said, "Look, Peter and Fran, who's my partner, they've been working on this for 2 years, Harvey. You've got to give them at least a chance to take this somewhere else. If you can't do it, there may be someone who can." Harvey said, "Okay, there's 2 conditions. One, it's got to be the 2 films. Somebody's got to agree to do 2 films, because I'm offering to do 1, so somebody's got to agree to do 2. The second condition is if somebody wants to do it, they've got to write me, they've got 4 weeks from now to write me a $20 million check." So we were now faced with the job of having to go to LA, to Hollywood, and try and convince somebody to write Harvey a $20 million check and finance 2 Lord of the Rings movies.
Jackson's next move was to put together a presentation piece, something that told their story, appropriately titled The Making of the Making of. Jackson would go on to call it the most important film he's ever made.
And so for the first week of our 4, we got a video team in. We interviewed ourselves, talking about The Lord of the Rings. It was like a making of The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Before it got made,
Right.
But the interesting thing with that tape is that we're all trying to sit there, be really positive and confident. And I'm being interviewed and I'm saying, the most wonderful thing about Tolkien's story is but we're all dying inside, because this is like the project is going to, unless this works, it's all over, and we're hoping.
It showed how they planned to use scale doubles with digital face replacements to create the hobbits. Amazing maquettes were made by Jimmy Bez Warwick of ringwraiths, orcs, and the Balrog, exactly how they would appear in the film.
We're all, and so we did all this lovely photography of these monsters where we turned them on turntables and lighting them, and we did it all pretty swish.
The plan was to bring everything that they created and go from meeting to meeting, pitching their ideas. But the trouble was, they'd only managed to schedule 2 meetings. A lot of studios questioned the viability of Tolkien.
And by the time we arrive in LA, our agent has gone through every studio, every producer who could possibly raise money, and he's virtually been turned down by everybody, even without seeing the tape, without meeting us. People just say, "No, we don't want to do it." Lord of the Rings, 2 movies, $20 million check to Harvey. No. And by the time we arrive in LA, there were only 2 meetings. There were only 2 people who wanted to even meet with us. Everyone else had passed.
The studios willing to listen to Jackson's pitch were New Line and Polygram. The first meeting was with Polygram, who distributed one of Jackson's earlier films, Brain Dead, in the UK. The trouble was, Polygram weren't really in a position to finance The Lord of the Rings. Jackson wanted around $180 million to do 2 films, but Polygram were in the process of being sold, and they actually folded in 1999. So realistically, Polygram couldn't make any commitments to finance the films, and even if they could negotiate with Jackson, it was going to take 2 to 3 months before they could do so, which was time Jackson didn't have. Jackson had 7 days left, which left New Line. That was their final hope.
New Line Cinema was our last shot, who had agreed to have a meeting, and at this point we were worried that we were going to be known as failures.
With nothing left to lose, Cummins decided to play some mind games with New Line and kept pushing back the meeting, implying that they were busy meeting other studios. But after what Cummins had deemed long enough, they finally scheduled the meeting.
You know, we had this one meeting that, like, we'd phone up New Line and say, meeting at New Line, 10 o'clock. No, we can't do 10. We've got a meeting. No, 1 o'clock. No, we're busy at 1. How about 3:30? And we tried to create this impression that we were kind of really being sought after, and we were going, because, I mean, it's terrible, isn't it?
And you had nothing.
We had nothing, no. So we turn up at our New Line meeting.
In the meeting was Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, producer Marty Katz, Mark Odesky, and the head of New Line, Bob Shea. Despite Mark Odesky pulling for Peter and Cummins' earlier mind games, they still weren't being taken seriously. In the end, though, it was Bob Shea who had the power to greenlight a 2-film adaptation of The Lord of the Rings. The meeting started off on the wrong foot because Bob Shea wasn't even there. Moments later, Mark Odesky walked into the room and announced that Bob would like to have a private word with Peter before coming to watch the tape. During the chat, Shea told Jackson that he was happy to spend an hour with them listening to their pitch, but he probably wasn't going to take it.
He had a private meeting with me first, and he said, look, Peter, I just want to, before I see your tape, I just want you to know that if we don't do this, I want you to know that you're always welcome to bring projects to me in the future. So I thought, oh, well, this is the classic kind of...
He's setting you up for the fall.
Setting me up for the fall.
So Jackson and Shea walked back into the room where everybody else was sat, and Mark Odesky pressed play on the 35-minute video that Jackson and his team had prepared.
I mean, he just sits there completely silently, just watches it, and we're just nervous. We can't stand it. We're in the same room as he is, and he's just watching.
Once the tape had finished, Shea looked Jackson dead in the face and said, why would we want moviegoers to pay $18 when they might pay $27?
Bob looked at Peter and said, now, Peter, why would anybody in their right mind make 2 movies?
Which shattered them both because they didn't quite know what he meant. He said, this is 3 films. Well, thank God for that decision.
Despite the good news, New Line weren't officially on board yet. Shea still had to show the tape to his partner Michael Lynn, but no more than 24 hours later, Cummins received a phone call. New Line were ready to start negotiating. But New Line weren't just negotiating a deal with Jackson. 3 separate deals had to be made. One with Miramax, a new one with Saul Zaentz, and of course, one with Peter Jackson. At the top of the list was Miramax, as they were due to be reimbursed their development money. Cummins was very clear with New Line about the conditions that Harvey had laid out. The deal with Miramax was the trickiest to navigate, but after about 4 weeks since the first meeting, New Line acquired the rights to The Lord of the Rings for $12 million. After that, a deal with Saul Zaentz was reached, who turned out to be good friends with New Line head Bob Shea, so negotiations went pretty smoothly. Zaentz's only real stipulation was that it had to be Peter Jackson directing. And then finally, the only other deal left to be made was with Peter himself and his production teams. Jackson's deal ended up being that he would be compensated for 1.5 films and receive some back-end bonuses. But before any official announcement could be made, the story was leaked to the LA Times. I won't go into detail here about the article, but if you guys do want to read it, I'll link it below if you're interested. The headline reads, New Line gambles on becoming Lord of the Rings. Now, I'm not sure if they had all the information at the time, but the article actually gets a lot of stuff wrong. For example, the article states that the release dates would be Fellowship of the Ring Christmas 2000, The Two Towers Summer 2001, and then finally The Return of the King Christmas 2001. But as I say, I'll link that below if you guys are interested.
New Zealand filmmaker Peter Jackson has clinched the biggest movie deal ever undertaken in the Southern Hemisphere. The multi-million-dollar deal will see Jackson make 3 films based on the Tolkien classic Lord of the Rings. Julie Roberts has the details.
Peter Jackson's always dreamed of making an epic fantasy film. This is a dream come true.
I never really thought that I'd one day get my hands on Lord of the Rings, which is like the holy grail of fantasy books. And it's 45 years since it was published. It's never been made into a film, and I never really dreamed that I'd be the guy to do that.
Jackson's been secretly working on the project for nearly 2 years, but has only now got the green light. $260 million from American film giant New Line Productions.
Now, the casting for The Lord of the Rings began in the summer of 1998. Now, obviously, if you're watching this, you know the cast that we ended up getting, and in my opinion, it's one of the greatest casts ever assembled. Now, obviously, I can't name everyone who ended up in different roles or who didn't get a role, but I thought I'd name the most interesting ones. New Line implied to Jackson that if he couldn't secure Sean Connery as Gandalf, he wouldn't get the green light. New Line were willing to offer Sean Connery $6 to $8 million per film and then 15% of the film's gross. But Sean Connery didn't end up in the role because he didn't understand the books, the scripts, or really any of it. Rest in peace, Sean Connery. But of course, the great Sir Ian McKellen ended up in the role. Dominic Monaghan auditioned for Frodo, but ended up in the role of Merry. Billy Boyd read for Merry and Pippin before ending up in the role of Pippin. Orlando Bloom read for Faramir before ending up as Legolas. Daniel Craig auditioned for Boromir but was beaten out by Sean Bean. And according to an interview on Jimmy Fallon, Jake Gyllenhaal auditioned for the role of Frodo.
Literally, Peter Jackson was like, what? And then I had a scene with lines, and I didn't have an accent, because everyone has a British accent in that, and I didn't do an accent for it. And he turned to me, he's like, you are the worst actor I have ever seen. He's like, did anyone tell you you're supposed to have an accent? I was like, no. He was like, well, fire your agents.
Now, a story that's been ingrained into the history of these films is that Viggo Mortensen wasn't originally cast as Aragorn. It was the Irish actor Stuart Townsend.
We had a hiccup in the casting process because another actor had been cast in the role of Aragorn, and we just came to a realization that we had cast the role a little too young. It caused us a lot of headaches because we were now shooting the film, we couldn't stop shooting it, and we only had a very limited number of days that we could shoot without the character of Aragorn.
Viggo's first day of shooting on The Lord of the Rings was actually day 12 of production.
Oh my God.
Well, Viggo was cast at the last minute because we were going another way with Aragorn, which didn't work, and we just started shooting. New Line were understandably nervous, not because of Viggo, but just because this drama had happened, and suddenly we didn't have anybody. Then we had Viggo and stuff, and so we were under strict orders that the second the first day's filming with Viggo was over, we had to dispatch the rushes to America, and they were withholding the permission to decide whether we had got the right guy or not. And luckily, it was fire, race, flames, and it just blew them away.
Hey guys, what's going on? I just wanted to jump on here really quickly and talk about the future of this series. Now, as you know, this was part 1. Part 2 will be coming in a couple of days, so if you want to see that, please subscribe. That's going to cover the filming of the Fellowship of the Ring. Then we're going to have part 3, which will be the Two Towers, part 4, which will be the conclusion of the entire series and be the Return of the King, and talk about the legacy of those films. There's also going to be some other content on this channel. I'm talking Star Wars, I'm talking Marvel, I'm talking DC, I'm talking makeup tutorials. I'm not doing makeup tutorials. And I also have a Twitter and Instagram, so if you feel like you would like to follow me on other social media platforms, something may pop up here, or nothing will pop up and I will look stupid. Anyways, thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. It truly means the world to me. Expect more content, and if any of that sounds interesting to you, please subscribe. And yes, part 2 will be coming very soon, within like the next couple of days. So if you want to see that, hit subscribe, and I will see you then. Peace.